At 11:43 p.m. on February 4, 1958, Mr. Theodore Henderson sat shivering in apartment 4C of his own building at 132nd Street and Lenox Avenue in Harlem, wearing nothing but his underwear and socks. 52 years old, owner of 14 tenement buildings across Manhattan, worth an estimated $2.3 million. The apartment was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Henderson had been locked inside for 19 hours. He had 6 more to go before Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson would decide whether he lived or died. 3 days earlier, a 9-week-old infant named Marcus Williams had been rushed to Harlem Hospital with pneumonia. The baby's mother, Sarah Williams, lived in apartment 2B of Henderson's building on 132nd Street. The building had been without heat for 47 days. The boiler had failed on December 19, 1957. Outside temperature that winter averaged 31 degrees. Inside the apartments, it was colder. Henderson owned the building. He lived in a heated townhouse on the Upper East Side. When tenants complained about the heat, Henderson told his building manager, a man named Eugene Polk, to tell them to wear more clothes. When Sarah Williams carried her baby to Polk's office on the ground floor and begged him to call Henderson, Polk handed her a piece of paper with Henderson's office address downtown. He told her to take it up with the owner herself. Sarah Williams couldn't afford the subway fare. She wrote a letter instead. Henderson never replied.
On February 1st, baby Marcus stopped breathing. Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy Jenkins, heard the mother screaming and ran to get help. An ambulance arrived 23 minutes later. They took Marcus to Harlem Hospital. The doctors stabilized him, but told Sarah her son had severe pneumonia caused by prolonged exposure to cold. The baby would survive, but his lungs might never fully recover. That same day, Mrs. Jenkins walked 6 blocks to the Palm Cafe on 133rd Street. She asked to speak with Bumpy Johnson.
If you want to see how a Harlem crime boss delivered justice that the city wouldn't, hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. Back to Bumpy. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was 51 years old in February 1958. He had served 2 prison terms, one for drug trafficking and one for assault. He had survived 11 attempts on his life. He controlled the numbers racket in Harlem, a gambling operation that generated approximately $50,000 per week. The police knew who he was. The FBI had a file on him 4 inches thick. But in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was something the government wasn't. He was someone who listened.
Mrs. Jenkins found Bumpy at his usual table in the back of the Palm Cafe. She told him about baby Marcus. She told him about the 47 days without heat. She told him about Henderson's refusal to fix the boiler. She told him about the letters Sarah Williams had written that received no response. Bumpy asked one question. "What's the landlord's name?" Mrs. Jenkins told him. "Theodore Henderson." Bumpy knew the name. Henderson owned buildings throughout Harlem. He was known among tenants as the Iceman, not because he was cool under pressure, but because his buildings were always cold. Henderson had a system. He bought old tenement buildings at foreclosure prices, filled them with black families desperate for housing, charged maximum legal rent, and spent minimum money on maintenance. When something broke, Henderson didn't fix it. He waited for the city to force him to fix it. The city rarely forced him. The system worked because Henderson understood the mathematics of power. His tenants were poor, mostly black, many from the South, some undocumented. They couldn't afford lawyers. They couldn't afford to move. They couldn't afford to miss work to appear in housing court. Even if they filed complaints, the city housing authority was backed up 14 months on inspection requests. By the time an inspector arrived, Henderson would make temporary repairs, pass the inspection, and let things break again. Henderson also understood that banks loved him. He paid his mortgage on time. He had excellent credit. He never defaulted. From a banker's perspective, Theodore Henderson was a model businessman running profitable residential properties in an economically depressed area. The fact that his properties were freezing death traps was irrelevant to quarterly reports. Bumpy Johnson listened to Mrs. Jenkins describe all of this. When she finished, Bumpy thanked her for coming to him. He told her to go home and tell Sarah Williams that the heat would be fixed. Mrs. Jenkins asked how he could promise that. Bumpy said, "Because Mr. Henderson is going to understand something he doesn't understand right now." The next morning, February 2nd,
Bumpy sent two of his associates to Henderson's office at 47th Street and 7th Avenue. The office was on the third floor of a commercial building. Henderson employed three people, a secretary, a bookkeeper, and Eugene Polk, who managed his buildings in Harlem. Bumpy's men didn't go to the office. They waited across the street. At 8:47 a.m., Theodore Henderson arrived in a black 1957 Cadillac Eldorado. He parked in a reserved spot behind the building. Henderson was a tall man, 6 feet 1 inch, 190 pounds. He wore an expensive overcoat, gray wool, and a fedora. He carried a leather briefcase. Bumpy's men watched him enter the building. They waited until 12:15 p.m., when Henderson came out for lunch. He walked to a deli 2 blocks away. Bumpy's men followed at a distance. They did not approach him. They simply observed. Henderson returned to his office at 1:03 p.m. He stayed until 5:38 p.m., then drove home to his townhouse at 76th Street and Park Avenue. Bumpy's men followed the Cadillac. They noted the address. They did not approach. That evening, Bumpy received the report. He now knew Henderson's routine, his office location, his home address, and his vehicle. The next step was contact. On the morning of February 3rd, Bumpy Johnson walked into Theodore Henderson's office at 9:15 a.m. He wore a dark suit, a tie, and a long wool coat. He carried no weapon. He was not alone. 2 associates waited outside, but Bumpy entered the office by himself. Henderson's secretary, a middle-aged white woman named Miss Carroll, looked up when Bumpy entered. She asked if he had an appointment. Bumpy said no, but he needed to speak with Mr. Henderson about one of his buildings. Miss Carroll told him Mr. Henderson only met with tenants by appointment. Bumpy asked how one made an appointment. Miss Carroll said tenants could write a letter requesting a meeting. Bumpy smiled. He said a tenant did write a letter. Mr. Henderson didn't respond, so I'm responding for her. Miss Carroll's expression changed. She recognized Bumpy. Everyone in New York who read newspapers recognized Bumpy Johnson. She picked up the phone to call someone. Police, building security, Henderson himself. Bumpy gently placed his hand over the receiver. He said, "I'm not here to cause trouble, Miss Carroll. I just need 5 minutes of Mr. Henderson's time. 5 minutes to discuss heat for a building where a baby nearly died."
Miss Carroll hesitated. She was not cruel. She had probably heard complaints before. She had probably filed them away. But now Bumpy Johnson was standing in front of her desk, and something in his voice told her this conversation was going to happen, whether she facilitated it or not. She buzzed Henderson's office. She told him someone was here to see him about a building issue. Henderson asked who. She whispered, "Ellsworth Johnson." There was a pause. Then Henderson said, "Send him in." Bumpy entered Henderson's private office. The room was warm. A radiator hissed in the corner. Henderson sat behind a mahogany desk. He did not stand when Bumpy entered. He did not offer a handshake. He said, "You've got 5 minutes." Bumpy sat down in the chair across from Henderson without being invited. He said, 132nd Street and Lenox, your building. No heat for 47 days. A baby got pneumonia. Mother wrote you a letter. You didn't respond. Henderson leaned back in his chair. He said, "I receive hundreds of letters. I can't respond to all of them." Bumpy said, "This one needed a response." Henderson said, "The boiler is broken. Repairs are expensive. I'll fix it when I can." Bumpy said, "You'll fix it today." Henderson's expression changed. The polite businessman facade dropped. He said, "I don't take orders from criminals, Mr. Johnson. If you have a complaint, file it with the city. Now get out of my office." Bumpy didn't move. He said, "I'm not ordering you. I'm asking you. Fix the heat. Do it today. I'll pay for it if money's the issue." Henderson laughed. He said, "You think I need your drug money? I make more in a month than you do in a year." Bumpy said, "Then you can afford the repairs." Henderson stood up. He pointed at the door. He said, "I said get out. You people are all the same. You think you can intimidate me because you run numbers in Harlem. I own property across this city. I have lawyers. I have connections. You touch me. You touch one of my buildings, and I'll have you back in prison where you belong." Bumpy stood slowly. He said, "I'm not going to touch you, Mr. Henderson. I'm going to give you 24 hours to fix that boiler. If it's not fixed, You and I are going to have a different conversation." Henderson said, "Are you threatening me?" Bumpy said, "I'm telling you what's going to happen. You can fix the heat, or I can show you what cold feels like."
Henderson walked to his door and opened it. He said, "Get out before I call the police." Bumpy walked out. Miss Carroll watched him leave. She did not look at Henderson. Something in the exchange had unsettled her. 24 hours passed. The boiler at 132nd Street and Lenox was not repaired. Henderson made no calls to contractors. He made no attempt to fix the heat. He told Eugene Polk that Bumpy Johnson was bluffing, that criminals didn't follow through on threats against respectable businessmen, and that the city would protect him if anything happened. Henderson was wrong. At 4:32 a.m. on February 4th, 3 men entered Theodore Henderson's townhouse on 76th Street. They used a key copied from the lock the previous day. The townhouse had no alarm system. Henderson and his wife, Margaret, were asleep on the second floor. The men moved quietly. They entered Henderson's bedroom. One man held a cloth over Margaret Henderson's face. Chloroform. She struggled for 4 seconds, then went limp. Another man pressed a hand over Theodore Henderson's mouth before he could scream. The third man held a knife to Henderson's throat.
Henderson's eyes went wide. He tried to speak. The man with the knife said, "Stay quiet. Do what we say. Your wife is asleep. She'll wake up fine in 3 hours. You might wake up fine too, if you cooperate." They pulled Henderson out of bed. They put a gag in his mouth. They tied his hands with rope. They stripped him to his underwear. They put a coat over his shoulders. Not his own expensive wool coat, but a thin cotton jacket. They walked him down the stairs and out to a car parked on the street, a black Buick. The engine was running. They drove north. Henderson sat in the back seat between 2 men. He could not speak. He could not see where they were going. A blindfold covered his eyes. The drive took 23 minutes. The car stopped. They pulled Henderson out. He felt cold air. He heard street sounds. Harlem. They walked him into a building. Henderson recognized the smell. Old wood, mildew, urine. A tenement building. His building. They walked upstairs. 4 flights. They opened a door. Apartment 4C. They pushed Henderson inside. They removed the blindfold. The apartment was bare. No furniture, no heat, just empty rooms and frozen pipes. One of the men said, "This is what 28 degrees feels like, Mr. Henderson. This is what your tenants feel every night." They removed the coat. They left Henderson in his underwear and socks. They locked the door from the outside. They left him there. Henderson stood in the center of the empty apartment. He could see his breath. He could feel the cold already seeping into his bones. He tried the door, locked. He tried the windows, sealed shut with nails. He yelled. No one answered. The building was mostly empty. Henderson himself had evicted half the tenants for non-payment. The remaining families were too afraid to investigate strange noises. Henderson sat on the floor. He pulled his knees to his chest. He tried to stay warm. The temperature did not rise. At 11:43 p.m., 19 hours after Henderson had been locked in apartment 4C, Bumpy Johnson arrived at the building. He climbed the 4 flights of stairs. He unlocked the door. He entered the apartment. Henderson was curled in a corner. His lips were blue. His skin was pale. He was shaking uncontrollably. He could barely speak. When he saw Bumpy, he whispered, "Please." Bumpy said, "How's the cold, Mr. Henderson?" Henderson said, "Please, I'll fix it. I'll fix the heat." Bumpy said, "Too late for that." Henderson started crying. He said, "What do you want?" Bumpy pulled out a piece of paper. He said, "You're going to sign this." Henderson said, "What is it?" Bumpy said, "Transfer of ownership. You're selling this building to the Greater Harlem Community Housing Fund for $1. Henderson said, "That's insane. This building is worth..." Bumpy said, "This building is worth nothing if you're dead. Sign it." Henderson said, "I'll go to the police." Bumpy said, "You'll tell the police what? That you were kidnapped? That you were held in your own building? The building you refused to heat? The building where a baby got pneumonia? You go to the police, Mr. Henderson, and every newspaper in New York will know what kind of man you are. Every tenant you've got will sue you. Every building inspector in the city will crawl over your properties. You'll be finished." Henderson said, "I have lawyers.
I have, Bumpy interrupted. He said, you also have a mortgage, Chase Manhattan Bank, $340,000 outstanding on this building alone. I bought the note yesterday. I now own your debt, Mr. Henderson.
Bumpy continued, you don't pay me, I foreclose. You fight me, I foreclose. You do anything other than sign this paper, and I take everything you own. Henderson stared at him. He said, you can't do that. Bumpy said, I just did. Now sign. Henderson's hand shook as he took the pen. He signed the paper. Bumpy took it, folded it, and put it in his coat pocket. He said, you've got 6 more hours here, Mr. Henderson. 6 hours to think about what cold feels like. Then my men will let you out. You'll go home. You'll never speak of this. You'll sell your other buildings in Harlem to legitimate buyers within 90 days. You'll leave this neighborhood. If I ever hear about you neglecting tenants again, anywhere in this city, I'll put you somewhere colder than this. Understood? Henderson nodded. Bumpy left. He locked the door behind him. Henderson spent 6 more hours in that apartment, the longest 6 hours of his life. At 5:47 a.m., Bumpy's men returned. They gave Henderson his clothes. They drove him home. They left him on his doorstep. Margaret Henderson was awake. She was terrified. She had called the police hours ago. 2 officers were in the house when Theodore arrived. He told them he had been at the office working late and had fallen asleep. The officers didn't believe him, but they had no evidence of a crime. They left. Theodore Henderson never spoke about what happened in apartment 4C. He sold 6 of his Harlem buildings within 60 days. He sold the rest within 90 days. He moved his remaining properties to New Jersey. Henderson never returned to Harlem. The building at 132nd Street in Lenox was transferred to the Greater Harlem Community Housing Fund, a nonprofit organization that provided affordable housing for low-income families. The boiler was repaired within 48 hours of the transfer. Baby Marcus Williams recovered. His lungs healed. He grew up in that building. He later became a teacher. Bumpy Johnson never faced charges for kidnapping Theodore Henderson. The police investigated, but Henderson refused to cooperate. Without a victim, there was no case. The FBI added a note to Bumpy's file. Subject continues to operate outside legal channels, but maintains community support in Harlem. What the FBI didn't understand was that Bumpy Johnson wasn't operating outside the law because he wanted to. He was operating outside the law because the law didn't work. The City Housing Authority had 3,847 open complaints in 1958. They had 11 inspectors. The average wait time for an inspection was 14 months. By the time an inspector arrived at a building, tenants had already frozen through a winter or baked through a summer. Children had gotten sick, families had been evicted. The system was designed to protect property owners, not tenants. Bumpy understood this. He understood that men like Henderson could hide behind lawyers and banks and slow bureaucracies. They could ignore letters and complaints and crying mothers because there were no consequences. The police didn't care about frozen apartments in Harlem. The mayor didn't care. The newspapers didn't care. But Bumpy cared. Not because he was a good man. He wasn't. But because he understood that power without accountability was cruelty, and cruelty without response was permission. Theodore Henderson learned something in that frozen apartment. He learned that money and connections and lawyers couldn't protect him if he pushed too far. He learned that there were people in the world who would hold him accountable when the system wouldn't. He learned that cold was more than a temperature. It was a lack of care, a lack of humanity. And when you forced other people to feel it, eventually you'd feel it yourself. The building at 132nd Street in Lenox operated for 31 more years under community management. It was demolished in 1989 to make way for new development. But the families who lived there during those 3 decades remembered it as the place where the heat always worked, where the landlord, a nonprofit board made up of tenants, actually fixed things when they broke, where children like Marcus Williams grew up warm. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968. He was 62 years old. He collapsed from a heart attack at the Wells restaurant in Harlem.
Hundreds of people attended his funeral. They remembered him as a criminal, yes, but also as someone who listened when no one else would. someone who acted when the system failed. Theodore Henderson died in 1979. He was 73 years old. His obituary in the New York Times described him as a prominent real estate investor. It did not mention the buildings in Harlem. It did not mention the cold. There is no monument to what happened in apartment 4C. No historical marker. No museum display. The building is gone. The people who lived there are scattered. But the story survived, passed down through families in Harlem, who remembered the winter, when a slumlord learned what cold felt like.
This is not a story about a hero. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal. He hurt people. He profited from addiction and desperation. But this is a story about a system so broken that even a criminal looked like justice. It's a story about what happens when the law protects property more than people. It's a story about a man who owned 14 buildings but couldn't afford humanity, and another man who had no legal authority but understood that sometimes the coldest thing in the world is indifference. If this story moved you, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this with more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're bringing you forgotten stories of justice, injustice, and the complicated people who lived between them.
Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you from Harlem? Do you have stories about slumlords in your city? Did someone in your family stand up when the system failed? Let us know. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive, making sure that people like Theodore Henderson are remembered for what they did, and people like Sarah Williams are remembered for what they survived. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure this story doesn't disappear into silence.